And we'll take you straight back to the Gaza Strip, where the Civil Defense Agency is giving an update on recent events. Let's listen in.
Today, we are entering into the 8th month of this genocide war. The civil defense team's efforts, humanitarian efforts all across the provinces of Gaza Strip have not been halted. Throughout this genocide war, we have performed 37,500 missions, which is equivalent to 24 years of hard work before the war. As a result, our heavy equipment and machinery have worn out. And although we are being targeted by the Israeli occupation forces, as we lost 39 civil defense members till this hour, the Israeli occupation forces continue to torpedo all the humanitarian efforts all across Gaza Strip. Although the international law provides certain protections to the civil defense teams, the Israeli occupation forces continue to violate this law, perpetrating killing among our members, destroying our heavy equipment, preventing us from recovering the dead bodies, even those survivors trapped under the debris. The Israeli occupation forces continue to target and destroy the heavy equipment that help us recover the victims. And above all, we are facing sharp shortage of fuel, whereby we will come to a total halt, whereby thousands of lives will be lost. Especially, we will not be able to recover dead bodies or survivors from under the debris. And as we speak, hundreds of victims remain buried under the rubble, and our teams are not able to recover them. And these numbers are continuing to rise. The lack of fuel exacerbates our problem. Therefore, we condemn the purposeful targeting by the Israeli occupation forces, where 39 of our members were killed, 150 injured. Many of them suffered repeated injuries on a number of occasions. We call on the international community to continue the Israeli occupation violations and purposeful targeting of our teams. We hold the Israeli accountable for targeting the civil defense members and all those performing humanitarian aid. Amid the total absence of heavy equipment and fuel, our efforts will not suffice to meet the basic minimum needs of our people, namely to recover hundreds of dead bodies and survivors from under the debris. Our efforts will be further impaired as the occupation forces have left more than 37,000 tons of debris all across the enclave. Silenced by the international community and the United Nations amid the continued crimes and this genocide war by the Israeli occupation forces, including the willful targeting of the civil defense and ambulance teams, means that these apparatuses are condemned to execution by the international community, as the international community remains silent amid the Israelis' continued violation. We call on the Secretary General of the United Nations and all the international organizations to lend a helping hand to the civil defense and all other humanitarian teams within the enclave. We renew our appeal to all the stakeholders, namely the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the International Association of Protection of Civil Defense, and all other concerned organizations to act swiftly in order to allow the unconditional delivery of heavy equipment required for the civil defense teams to operate all across the enclave, namely in the north. Especially, we are faced with a massive dilemma, namely the bloated and reeking bodies being decomposed under the debris. We call on the International Red Cross to exercise more pressure on the Israeli occupation forces in order to allow the intervention by the civil defense and ambulance teams in the targeted area, especially that dozens are being killed and buried under the debris. Survivors are trapped under the rubble. This is a statement issued on this day by the Civil Defense Department of Gaza Strip.
All right, you've been listening to the Palestinian Civil Defense Agency. They were talking just outside Al-Aqsa Hospital, that's in Deir el-Balah, in the central part of the Gaza Strip. As a reminder, there is fighting going on in the north around Jabalia. There's fighting going on in the south around Rafah, and people who have been fleeing Rafah in their hundreds of thousands have been coming towards the center of the Strip, which has not made them any safer over the last few days, as we've seen. 14 Palestinians were killed overnight in Nuseirat, in the central part of the Strip. All right, let's bring in Mohammed El-Masri, political analyst, professor of media studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. You were listening to this with us. The Civil Defense Agency really spotlighting how difficult, I would say almost impossible, listening to them, it is to do their job. They are the people who go to the blast sites, the target sites after an Israeli strike, and they try to pull the injured and the dead out of the rubble, and they're saying it's become almost impossible.
Right. And I think it's important to take a step back and think about Israel's larger strategy here. Israel has a philosophy, an ideology called Greater Israel. It's kind of a policy. They want to be able to take over all of the land. They believe that all of the land, from the river to the sea, should belong to the Jews, and it must be purified of the Arab presence.
Yeah, it's one vision for what the country should be.
Absolutely, and it's increasingly popular. And Israelis, it used to be sort of unspoken. Now they're saying it out loud, and that was one of the goals. It's quite clear from early October for this war. They wanted to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, and part of that involves making life completely uninhabitable. And that's what I think is happening. Gaza is now pretty much uninhabitable. There was a report released within the last 2 weeks by the United Nations that said it'll take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. There's just not much left in terms of just infrastructure and services, even if the war ended today.
Some numbers on that, to your point, 70%, and I think it's the same source as the UN, saying 70% of buildings have been either totally destroyed or partially destroyed. And a data point that was just given to us by the Civil Defense Agency, they say 37 tons of debris are strewn across Gaza when these buildings are hollowed out or destroyed. Right.
And then you also have the problem of the unexploded bombs, which experts are saying will take about 14 years to clear. So those are humanitarian disasters waiting to happen. And so it begs the question, what next? What is the end game? What's going to happen to all of these people? And I think Israel's hope is still that Egypt is going to open those borders, or that they will be forced open, and that all the Gazans will flood into Egypt.
That's so interesting. You're not the first analyst who has sat there since the beginning of this war and said, even in the early days, you and a couple of your colleagues were saying, Israel's goal is to move Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. That hasn't happened. All the most somber, most pessimistic predictions in terms of the number of people killed, et cetera, have come to pass. But the one of moving Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip, it has, to the extent that many Palestinians have left, those who could either afford to bribe their way out or who are dual nationals. But Israel hasn't actually moved wholesale Palestinians out of the Strip. That hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened because Israel hasn't been able to do it. Israel does have to operate under certain constraints. There are political constraints. So one of the things that I think Israel expected to happen was that Egypt would give in and open its borders. They started asking this question in October. Why doesn't Egypt open its borders and take these people in as refugees? Egypt, for its part, has been completely unwilling to do that. And we've seen Egypt now, within the last 48 hours, adding its name to this ICJ case, the genocide case that South Africa brought against Israel at the World Court, because they're so unhappy with Israel violating these agreements related to Rafah, which is supposed to be a demilitarized zone. Israel's taking it over.
Everything but demilitarized now.
Exactly. So Egypt hasn't been willing to open its border, and the United States hasn't been willing to go so far as to fully support this kind of mass population transfer. That's why it hasn't happened yet.
They have vocally said, the U.S., that they oppose it. They said there cannot be a reduction of the Palestinian population in Gaza.
Absolutely. But the question becomes, if pressure continues to be exerted, if Netanyahu gets his wish, in December, he said he wants this war to go on, or he expected the war to go on throughout 2024. So if we're sitting here, Cyril, in December or November, and we're still talking about a war on Gaza, what will be left? And will Israel ultimately be able to force the hand of the United States, of Egypt, and of the international community?
What will be left and how many will be left? Because there's every indication that Israel has been using starvation as a weapon of war. It's been accused of doing so. There's every objective reason to believe that's the case. They are deciding to block the aid from the Gaza Strip. The UN has said it's a full-blown famine. The definition of famine is that people are dying, right? They're dying because they don't have enough food.
And if people aren't dying of famine, and they're dying of the bombs. Israel has a kill zone policy. We're talking about this UN worker who was killed. There were 3 Israelis waving white flags a couple of months ago, and they were killed. Israel has a kill zone policy. That's why all these that's one of the reasons why so many civilians are killed. There are other reasons, of course. Israel has this 20-to-1 ratio, this 100-to-1 ratio, this kind of calculus for how many civilians it's willing to kill if it identifies a Hamas fighter in a particular area. So, to your point, if the Gazans aren't dying of starvation, they may be dying of bombs.
If we pull all those threads together, everything all these issues that you've just raised, what do you think is the end game? Because it's actually really hard to see one. I mean, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu speaks of total victory, and victory in his mind equals wiping out Hamas. No one's holding their breath on that right now. What do you think he's actually really aiming to do then?
Well, I think there are multiple things. I think he wants to prolong the war as much as possible. I do think he wants to eliminate Hamas, but I also think he wants to depopulate the Gaza Strip. I think that's a goal for him. It's also the goal of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others on the far right in Israel. You know, the question, and again, I said this in our last conversation, I don't want to be reductionist about it, but so much of this comes down to what the United States is going to do and what they're willing to tolerate. And that's what I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to that question.
Okay, well, since you bring that up, I did say that there was a conversation waiting to happen there, right? We have a few minutes. Hani Mahmoud's going to be coming up for us from Deir el-Balah in just a moment. So let's take this minute to have that conversation. You said this is likely going to cost Joe Biden the election. That's the most affirmative that I've heard any of our analysts be on that issue.
Well, CNN did a poll not long ago. It shows, I think it was last week, it shows that Biden is trailing Donald Trump by 6 percentage points in the kind of the overall popular vote right now. More substantively, though, 538, which is a website that does opinion polling, they're showing that Trump is leading Biden in 6 of the 7 swing states.
Yeah.
There's no path forward for Joe Biden if he doesn't win a majority of those swing states. So barring something cataclysmic, I don't see how, what the way forward is for the Biden campaign.
But the counter argument, I suppose, would be, I mean, Joe Biden may well lose, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's because of Gaza. I believe recent polling shows that as far as priorities voted for voters, Gaza's in the top 5, but it's not 1, 2, or 3.
But it's enough. You see, it's enough to push those swing voters into the direction of Donald Trump. Right? We saw this happen in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota and other states where people showed up to the polls at the primaries and just voted uncommitted, undecided, right? So they were protest voting. The numbers that we have just from those states would be enough, based on the 2020 election figures, would be enough to propel Donald Trump to victory in those states. So it's very damaging. That same CNN poll, by the way, shows that 39% of college students in the United States are now identifying as pro-Palestinian. Only 11% are identifying as pro-Israelis. Those college students are going to vote in this upcoming election, and they're going to have a strong say in who the next president of the United States is.
But here's my question. Team Biden doesn't want to throw away this election. Under no circumstance, under no pretext, and for no reason do they want to sacrifice a second term, right? They don't want to throw away this election. So I listen to you, and I assume that means they're making a different calculation.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me to make sense of it, I can't.
I am a little bit.
I can't make sense of it. I'm not the first person to say this. In fact, it's been months now where other analysts, including in the United States, have been saying that Biden has committed political suicide. And that's the best, I think that's the best 2-word sort of description of what's happening here. Now, why he's doing that, that's anybody's, best guess at this point. I don't have a rational explanation. Why the Democrat? For them, this is a disaster to have Donald Trump reappear as the president. Second time over, Trump 2.0. It would be a disaster for the Democrats, but how can we explain 7 months of complicity in genocide. As I said in the last interview.
Well, I think the first few months, they didn't think it was going to cost them politically. Of course, the wind has kind of turned.
Well, I would argue that by about November, it was pretty clear that this was a disaster. Not, forget about the humanitarian side of things for a moment. I think it was a disaster for the United States politically. And I think we can see that if you go back and read some of the analyses that were published in November. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to have an excuse. When it's all said and done, they're going to have no one to blame but themselves.
Mohammed al-Masri, I said there was a conversation waiting to happen on that issue, right, of American support and why and what consequences it might have. I'm glad that we took the time to have it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, let's go to Hani Mahmoud. Hani, you're in Deir al-Balah, just outside the Al-Aqsa Hospital. We just heard the Gaza Civil Defense Agency a few minutes ago talk from roughly where you're standing outside the hospital. And what they were explaining, Hani, is that this is the one thing that stayed with me, will stay with me, I think, the longest. They said they've carried out 37,000 missions since the beginning of this war. That is the equivalent of 20 years of work at the pre-war rate.
Yes, absolutely, and it does show the largest scale of destruction across the Gaza Strip, and and around the hour they've been working. They've been everywhere, virtually across the Gaza Strip, to areas that have been bombed or targeted by the Israeli military, doing their best and to the best of their capacity to provide help, support, and help those who are trapped and under rubbles, or save those who are in targeted sites. And that large number of missions that have been performed by the civil defense crew to show how difficult the situations have been. We spoke briefly after the press conference just to get a sense of how they manage all of this, and it's beyond anyone could imagine the level of coordination and the level of ability available, given the fact that they've been deliberately targeted as well on the ground. Civil defense crew members on the ground have been deliberately targeted by the Israeli military more than one time throughout the past 7 months of this war. We talked about the challenges that are on every day at any given unfolding situation across the Gaza Strip, and the fact that there are evacuation orders from one place to another that has affected the effectiveness and the level of response of the civil defense crew member to provide efficient and emergency and quick response to their work on the ground. The intense bombing campaign, it's one of the things that pointed out as a major challenge to ensure safety for civil defense crew member on the ground. It has been quite difficult, and we see them. We see them either in Rafah city or here in Deir el-Balah within the past few days, and their work more before that in the northern part in Gaza city under unusually difficult circumstances. One thing that stands out right now, other than the large number of missions performed on the ground, is the lack of equipment, the lack of the proper machinery. Also, in terms of human resources, it has been quite difficult for them. They lost many of the civil defense crew members. They resorted into volunteering system, and that as well is experiencing extreme shortage right now. Just given how difficult it is, they're still performing across the strip, trying to be at every targeted site at the best of their capacity. But there is a need, a necessary need for help and support for the civil defense department, civil defense crew members on the ground, in order to continue performing. The lack of fuel right now is on top of the lack of machinery equipment is affecting also the level of response and their ability to move from one place to another and to respond quickly to targeted sites.
Yeah, and I'll repeat what they said, that they do this at extreme danger to themselves. 39 civil defense personnel have been killed since the beginning of the war. Hani Mahmoud, thank you again for your reporting from Deir al-Balah.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.